What is the limit of human biology? Where is the line where known science ends and the impossible begins? We place our faith in medicine to provide answers, to bring order to the chaos of the flesh. But history is a library of forgotten case files, moments that defy all logic and force us to question everything we thought we knew. Tonight, we open one of those files. Our story begins on a cold, damp morning in the autumn of 1726 in the small English town of Godalming. This was the Age of Enlightenment, an era where the bright flame of reason was locked in a desperate battle with the lingering shadows of superstition. And in a cramped, dark cottage, that battle was about to find its most bizarre stage. A crowd gathers, their breath fogging the air, their faces a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. They are not here for a celebration. They are here to witness either a miracle or a monstrosity. In the center of it all is a 25-year-old woman named Mary Toft, and she is giving birth. The man attending to her, a respected local surgeon named John Howard, had seen 30 years of deliveries. He had witnessed joy and he had witnessed tragedy, but he had never, ever seen this. As Mary's contractions intensify, something finally emerges. Howard holds it up for the stunned crowd to see. It is not a child. It is not even human. It is the bloody, lifeless head of a rabbit. Welcome to Medical Obscura. I am your narrator. Tonight, we dissect the astonishing case of Mary Toft, the peasant woman who held an entire kingdom captive, who baffled the greatest medical minds of her time, and who perpetrated what might be the most audacious hoax in the annals of medicine. We will follow the story as it unfolds, from this small, terrified room all the way to the royal court of King George I. The strange events in Godalming would soon ignite a firestorm across Europe. Doctors, scientists, and nobles would all ask the same impossible question: how could a woman give birth to an animal? To understand the answer, we must begin not with the miracle, but with the woman at its center. Mary Toft's life was one of relentless hardship. At 18, she was married to Joshua Toft, a man born into the ancient cloth trade, but with none of the skill it demanded. For them, poverty wasn't a risk. It was a daily reality, a constant, gnawing presence. This harsh existence was punctuated by personal tragedy. In 1723, her first child, a daughter, was taken by the scourge of smallpox. A year later, a son, James, survived. But another mouth to feed only tightened the grip of their destitution. To survive, Mary herself joined the ranks of the day laborers, performing grueling agricultural work from dawn until dusk, plowing fields, sowing seeds, harvesting crops. It was there, in the dirt and toil of the English countryside, on April 23, 1726, that the seed of our mystery was planted. 5 weeks pregnant with another child, Mary was weeding in the fields when she saw them, a skittering of rabbits. In that moment, they weren't just animals. They were a meal, a rare, hearty meal she desperately craved. She gave chase, but was too slow. The rabbits vanished. But they did not leave her. That night, they returned in a vivid, unsettling dream. In the days that followed, the dream festered into a powerful, obsessive craving. A yearning for rabbit meat that she could not satisfy. In 18th century England, rabbits were a delicacy of the wealthy elite, their breeding and sale a privilege of the upper class, far beyond the reach of a family like the Tofts. 4 months later, that pregnancy ended in disaster. Mary suffered what was at least her second miscarriage. Her mother-in-law, Anne, a local midwife, attended to her. The family, too poor to afford a surgeon, dealt with the matter privately. But Anne would later describe what Mary delivered. Not a stillborn child, but a large, misshapen piece of tissue,
as large as a man's arm. It was the first sign that something was deeply wrong. A month later, on September 27th, the quiet suffering of the Toft household was shattered by screams. A neighbor, a Mrs. Gill, heard the cries and rushed to help. She found Mary writhing on the floor, clutching her stomach in agony.
And before anyone could fetch a doctor, Mrs. Gill saw it, a strange shape emerging from between Mary's legs. This was no ambiguous mass of tissue. It was the dead, mangled body of a cat. Unable to comprehend what had happened, the family sent the impossible specimen to Mr. John Howard, a respected surgeon and man midwife practicing in the nearby town of Guildford. Howard was a man of experience. For 30 years, he had seen the best and the worst of human biology. But when a messenger arrived bearing the mangled corpse of a cat, claiming it had been delivered from a woman's womb, he was utterly baffled. It was impossible, a violation of every principle he had ever known. And yet, in an age caught between scientific discovery and lingering folklore, was anything truly impossible? John Howard was a man of his time, an era of profound contradiction. The age of enlightenment was dawning, a period of explosive scientific advancement. The scientific method, a revolutionary idea championed by minds like Galileo, demanded that claims be backed by measurable, observable, and verifiable evidence. For the first time, proof was valued more than eloquent arguments, and for the great thinkers of Europe, this was an exhilarating challenge. But the light of reason cast long shadows. For every scientist in a lab, there was a charlatan on a street corner. Quack remedies and folk superstitions still held immense power over the public. It was a world where a respected cleric like John Wesley could, with a straight face, recommend curing stomach pains by holding a live puppy against the belly. This was the battleground on which Mary Toft's case would be fought. A clash between the rigorous demands of new science and the deeply ingrained belief that the world still held ancient dark magic. Howard, faced with this impossible story, felt the pull of both worlds. His training told him it was a lie, but his ambition, his curiosity, whispered another possibility. What if it were true? To be the one to prove that a human could give birth to an animal, it would not just be a discovery, it would be the single greatest medical revelation of the century. Driven by this thought, he traveled the 5 miles to Godalming to examine Mary himself. Upon his arrival, Mary's mother-in-law, Anne Toft, presented him with more pieces of the cat, claiming they had been delivered overnight. Neighbors corroborated the story. Examining Mary, Howard confirmed that her contractions were real and unusually strong. But this wasn't enough. He was a man of evidence, and he needed something undeniable. He told the family, "I will not believe she is gestating animals until she delivers a head before my own eyes." He did not have to wait long. 2 weeks later, a frantic message arrived. Howard rushed back to Godalming. Mary claimed to have delivered the jawbone of an animal, followed by a wave of blood. As Howard watched, 2 more pieces of bone emerged from between her legs. With trembling hands, he took the fragments and assembled them. There was no doubt. They formed the unmistakable skull of a rabbit. In that moment, John Howard's skepticism shattered. He was no longer an observer. He was a believer. He became the first medical professional to officially vouch for Mary's miraculous births. And he would certainly not be the last. The story of Mary's rabbits was about to escape the confines of her small cottage and attract the attention of the most powerful people in Europe, propelling a poor, uneducated woman into unimaginable infamy. With John Howard now convinced he was witnessing a medical miracle, the strange events in Godalming accelerated.
By November, Mary was producing animal parts with alarming regularity. After the 9th rabbit specimen was delivered, Howard made a fateful decision. He moved Mary from her humble cottage into his own house in Guildford. He wanted to observe her more closely, to document this impossible phenomenon without distraction or interference. Under his watchful eye, the deliveries continued, and they were disturbingly convincing. Pieces of rabbit, seemingly accompanied by blood and amniotic fluid, the very hallmarks of a genuine birth. Howard even developed a hypothesis for a strange, pulsating movement he felt on Mary's right side. It must be, he theorized, her right fallopian tube, where the rabbits themselves were being formed. A theory that, while biologically absurd, seemed to be the only explanation. Howard began writing letters, frantic, excited letters to physicians and noblemen, detailing his discovery. Soon, the story was picked up by the burgeoning print media. On October 22, 1726, the British Journal published an account of the case. Suddenly, the story was no longer a local rumor. It was a national sensation. London's coffee houses buzzed with the news. Pamphlets were printed. Was Mary Toft a fraud or a miracle? A saint or a witch? The public was split down the middle. And inevitably, the whispers and headlines reached the highest corridors of power, the royal court of King George I. The king, a rational man, was deeply curious. He ordered 2 men to go to Guildford and ascertain the truth. One was an amateur scientist, Samuel Molyneux. The other was the royal anatomist, a Swiss surgeon named Nathaniel Saint-André. Saint-André was a man of immense ambition, a social climber desperate to prove his worth to the English court. For him, this was not just a medical investigation. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. On November 15th, the 2 royal officials arrived at Howard's house, and their timing was impeccable. Mary was in the throes of labor, about to deliver her 15th rabbit. The moment Saint-André saw the top half of the animal emerge from between Mary's legs, he was captivated. He personally extracted the carcass's lungs for a well-known scientific test of the era. He placed the organs in a bowl of water. They floated. The science was clear. Lungs that float have taken in air. The rabbit had, at some point, been alive outside of the womb. This should have been the end of the story. The definitive proof of a hoax. But Saint-André, blinded by his desire for fame, chose to see something else. He did not see evidence. He saw a miracle. He declared that the lungs floated because, in this miraculous case, they were not bound by the normal laws of physics. The birth was simply supernatural. Later that day, Mary delivered the bottom half of the rabbit. The 2 pieces fit together perfectly. Saint-André's examination continued. He discovered pellets of rabbit dung in the creature's rectum, another undeniable sign that the animal had lived and eaten outside the womb. And again, he ignored it. He dismissed it as just another biological anomaly in a case that was full of them. He was no longer a scientist. He was a true believer. In the days that followed, the evidence against Mary's story mounted. But for Saint-André and Howard, every contradictory clue was not a sign of fraud, but a new layer to the miracle. Saint-André dissected the first cad Mary had supposedly delivered. He discovered it was missing a liver. The carcass also, inexplicably, contained the backbone of an eel. Instead of raising alarms, this led the men to a wild hypothesis that different animal species were somehow combining inside Mary's womb, creating strange hybrid creatures. More red flags appeared. The bleeding and amniotic fluid that had made the initial birth so convincing had stopped. The physicians had no explanation. Then there was the most damning physical evidence of all, Mary's cervix. The cervix connects the vagina to the uterus, and it only opened significantly during labor to allow a child to pass through. But in Mary's case, her cervix remained tightly closed, even during her most violent contractions. It was a biological impossibility.
A delivery from the uterus could not happen this way, and yet Saint Andre overlooked it. Determined to prove his theory, he performed one final test. He examined Mary's birth canal just before an expected delivery. He confirmed it was empty. A short while later, she produced another rabbit head. For Saint Andre, this was the final, irrefutable proof. If the passage was empty one moment and contained a rabbit the next, then the creature had to be coming from somewhere deeper inside, from the womb itself. Brimming with confidence, Saint Andre and his colleague returned to London. They presented their findings and the preserved rabbit specimens to King George. Saint Andre's conclusion was bold and unwavering. Mary Toft's births were authentic. She was a true medical marvel. The king was now faced with an even more perplexing question. Not if it was happening, but why? The public, fueled by sensationalist pamphlets, had already formed their own theories. Some whispered of bestiality, that Mary had copulated with an animal. A scandalous idea, but one without any scientific basis. Instead, the medical establishment rallied around a far more popular and, in their view, more scientific explanation, a theory known as maternal imagination. This was a deeply rooted belief in 16th to 18th century Europe. The idea was simple yet powerful, that a pregnant woman's intense emotions or experiences could physically alter the fetus within her. If a woman was frightened by a large dog, her child might be born with a hairy birthmark. If she obsessed over frogs, her baby could develop webbed toes. It was the go-to explanation for birth defects in an age before genetics were understood. Some of its proponents, like the London obstetrician John Mowbray, took the theory to fantastical extremes. He even believed in creatures called Souterkins, mole-like animals he claimed were born to Dutch women who spent too much time near hot stoves. For men like Sandro and Howard, maternal imagination was the perfect answer. Mary's obsessive craving for rabbits after her dream must have been so powerful it imprinted upon her womb, causing her to miscarry her human child and begin producing bunnies instead. It was strange, it was unprecedented, but in their world, it was plausible. But King George I was not entirely convinced. While Saint Andre was a man of the court, the king was a man of prudence. He needed a second opinion, a dissenting voice. He summoned a skeptical German surgeon named Cyriacus Ahlers and dispatched him to Guildford with a simple command: discover the truth. Ahlers arrived on November 20th, not as an investigator, but as an actor. He suspected a fraud from the very beginning, and he knew that the only way to expose it was to play along. He presented himself as a gullible believer, hoping Mary and Howard would lower their guard and make a mistake. His private examination confirmed his suspicions immediately. Mary showed none of the classic signs of pregnancy. Her stomach wasn't swollen, she wasn't producing milk, and the blood and amniotic fluid that Howard had described in his early reports had conveniently vanished. Ahlers also questioned why the rabbits always emerged in pieces. Howard had a ready answer. Mary's powerful convulsions were so violent they simply tore the animals apart inside her womb. Ahlers wasn't buying it. During one of Mary's supposed labor sessions, Howard allowed him to feel the emerging rabbit. Ahlers, perhaps deliberately, pushed the creature further back into the birth canal, causing Mary to scream in pain. After that, Howard refused to let him get close again. To Ahlers, this wasn't caution, it was a cover-up. At the end of the day, he put on his best performance. He told Mary he believed her story was real, and even gave her a bit of money for her troubles. But the next day, back in London, he stood before the king and declared the entire affair to be a blatant hoax. His conclusion was chillingly simple. The animal remains weren't being torn apart by convulsions. They were being cut apart by a knife. When news of this damning report reached Nathaniel Saint-André, he panicked. His reputation, his position at court, his entire future was on the line. He had publicly staked his name on Mary's authenticity. If she was proven a fraud, he would be a laughingstock. He rushed back to Guildford, desperate to find irrefutable proof to silence Offlers. And within days, he found what he was looking for. During a delivery, Mary produced something new, a slimy, mucus-like membrane. St. Andre and Howard immediately identified it as a piece of the chorion, the outermost membrane that forms the placenta. This, in their minds, was the ultimate evidence of a real pregnancy. But as Saint-André celebrated his discovery, his patient was deteriorating. Mary's health was getting visibly worse. She complained of escalating pain. Her pulse was irregular. Her tongue was white. There was blood and mucus in her urine. These were all clear, textbook signs of a raging infection. But the doctors, obsessed with proving their miracle, were more interested in validating Mary than in treating her. Her health was a secondary concern. Saint-André rushed back to London, his proof in hand. In a dramatic presentation before the king and his court, he dissected the rabbit specimens, arguing their small organs proved they were fetal. And for his grand finale, he unveiled the piece of placenta. This, he declared, was the smoking gun. A placenta only forms to feed a fetus. The court was convinced. The newspapers exploded. Nathaniel Saint-André and John Howard were hailed as heroes of science. And as their fame grew, Allers could only fume in the background. He knew something was terribly wrong, and Mary Toft was getting sicker by the day. With his court divided, the king ordered a final, definitive investigation. Mary Toft was to be brought to London. If this was a true medical phenomenon, it needed to be studied by the very best minds in the country. Among them was Sir Richard Manningham, a renowned and deeply respected obstetrician. On November 28th, he arrived in Guildford alongside Saint-André. His initial examination was blunt and professional. Mary showed no signs of pregnancy. Her cervix was closed, her womb felt empty. The only strange sign was a peculiar hardness on her right side, near the fallopian tube. It was an anomaly, but it wasn't proof. Manningham declared he would not believe a word of it until he personally witnessed a birth. They waited for hours. Nothing. Eventually, the two men left for a quick meal at a nearby inn. Less than an hour later, John Howard burst through the door, triumphantly carrying a piece of paper. Inside was a slimy organ. While they were gone, he claimed, Mary had delivered more placenta. But Sir Richard was not impressed. He was furious. "The whole reason I am here is to observe," he reprimanded Howard. "I should have been summoned before the birth." He eyed the specimen with disdain, adding dryly, "In any case, this looks more like half a hog's bladder than a placenta." The seeds of doubt were now firmly planted. To resolve the matter, Mary was moved to Lacey's Bath House in Leicester Fields, London. The location was chosen for a reason. It was a public place, easily accessible, where she could be watched around the clock. The king wanted as many eyes on her as possible. One of the first to arrive was James Douglas, a famous anatomist and an expert on the female pelvic organs. Unlike the others, Douglas was utterly convinced from the start that the entire affair was a hoax. His theory was simple and direct. There was no miracle. Mary was manually inserting the animal parts into her own vagina. He stressed one crucial point to the other doctors. Mary must not, under any circumstances, be left alone. Douglas's examination was methodical. He felt the strange pulsations in her abdomen and dismissed them as simple muscle contractions, something Mary could control at will. The bathhouse quickly became a strange sort of tourist destination. Doctors, noblemen, and scientists all flocked to see the famous rabbit breeder of Godalming.
But they were all left disappointed. Under the constant, unblinking surveillance, the miracles had stopped. Days went by, and Mary produced nothing. For skeptics like Manningham and Douglas, this was highly suspicious. They decided it was time to go public with their doubts. They informed the local justice of the peace, Lord Thomas Onslow, of their suspicions.
Giving birth to rabbits wasn't technically a crime, but this spectacle had spiraled into a national scandal, and it was time for the law to get involved. Lord Onslow began his own, separate investigation. He traveled back to Guildford, not to examine Mary, but to examine her story. He interviewed local rabbit sellers, and one by one, they told the same tale. Mary's husband, Joshua, had been a frequent customer, buying young rabbits around the time of his wife's supposed deliveries. When confronted, Joshua claimed he was simply buying them for his wife to eat. A plausible excuse, until Lord Onslow spoke with the cook at John Howard's house, who stated she had never once prepared rabbit for Mary. The first crack in the conspiracy had appeared. Meanwhile, back in the bathhouse, Mary's condition was worsening. While her miraculous births had stopped, her genuine suffering had not. She was now experiencing frequent, violent seizures, likely the result of a raging infection. On December 4th, she began to writhe in agony, her pains so real that even the skeptical Sir Richard Manningham thought a delivery might finally be imminent. But after hours of torment and no birth, the entire hoax unraveled because of one man. A bathhouse porter, also named Thomas Howard, pulled Sir Richard aside. The porter confessed. Mary's sister-in-law had secretly given him money to procure a fresh, small rabbit and smuggle it into her room. This was it, the smoking gun, the final, undeniable proof of fraud. Before the doctors could act on this information, Mary let out a final, desperate cry. For a moment, Sir Richard saw a severe swelling above her cervix and wondered if, against all odds, something was truly happening. But then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The signs of labor halted. Mary went limp and quiet. There was no birth. There was only silence. The performance was over. That night, a justice of the peace was summoned to take the porter's official statement. Shortly after, Mary Toft was taken into custody. For 2 days, she was interrogated relentlessly by doctors and law enforcement. But she held firm, clinging to her impossible story. Finally, Sir Richard Manningham delivered an ultimatum. If she did not confess by the next morning, he would perform a painful, invasive surgery to discover the truth himself. He would, in his own words, slice her open. The threat worked. On December 7th, 1726, Mary Toft finally gave in. She confessed everything. The truth, when it came out, was both simple and grotesque. Just as James Douglas had suspected, there was no miracle. Her family, with the help of her mother-in-law Anne, had procured, skinned, and dissected the rabbits. Then they had manually inserted the pieces into her vagina. But what was the motive? Poverty was the obvious answer, a desperate attempt to gain fame and escape a life of toil. But historians suggest more complex reasons. Perhaps it was a way to reclaim agency after the shame of a miscarriage in an era where the woman was always blamed. Or perhaps it was an act of rebellion, a piece of social commentary. In 18th century England, rabbits were a symbol of the gentry. Only the wealthy could breed and eat them. By having a poor, common woman give birth to these symbols of the elite, the Tofts were, in a way, mocking the very class structure that oppressed them. And by making the nation's greatest minds believe it, they exposed the so-called superiority of the upper class as a sham. So, how did she pull it off? How did a poor, uneducated woman fool the nation's best and brightest? The mechanics of the hoax were grimly simple. Her body was still recovering from a genuine miscarriage, which explained the initial bleeding and fluid that made the first births so convincing. Her very real pain, her contractions, her seizures, these were not entirely an act. They were the symptoms of a severe, life-threatening infection. By repeatedly inserting the unsterilized remains of dead animals into her vagina, Mary had introduced a host of dangerous bacteria into her body. In a world before antibiotics, before even a basic understanding of germ theory, this was a terrifying gamble. The swelling, the fever, the blood in her urine, it was all evidence of an infection raging through her system. The fact that she survived this ordeal is perhaps the only real miracle in this entire story. The strange, hard mass on her right side was never definitively explained, a final, lingering mystery in a case full of them. Once her confession was made public, the fallout was swift and brutal. Mary was imprisoned on charges of being a notorious and vile cheat. Yet she remained a celebrity. Crowds gathered outside Bridewell Prison, hoping for a glimpse of the infamous rabbit breeder. King George I, humiliated by the affair, hated the attention. Eager for the scandal to die down, he ordered her quiet release after only a few months. The doctors who had been duped faced a harsher sentence in the court of public opinion. Nathaniel St. André, the ambitious royal anatomist, was ruined. He lost his royal salary, his prestigious clients, and became the target of vicious satire, most famously by the artist William Hogarth. His career never recovered. John Howard's reputation faltered, but he eventually returned to his practice in Surrey. The skeptics, like Sir Richard Manningham and James Douglas, were praised for their methodical see. And Mary Toft? She returned to Godalming. She faded back into the obscurity from which she came, working once more as a day laborer. The very next year, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, a healthy human child. She lived out the rest of her days in relative anonymity. By all accounts, she resumed an ordinary life. But there was nothing ordinary about Mary. She was a fraud, a cheat, a performer. But she was also a woman who, armed with a gruesome idea and an astonishing tolerance for pain, held a mirror up to an age of scientific anxiety and social inequality. She fooled doctors, nobles, and a king. And in doing so, she solidified her place in history as the author of perhaps the greatest and most bizarre medical fraud of all time. The story of Mary Toft is just one file from our archives. There are countless others, each a testament to the enduring mystery of the human body and the strange paths medicine has walked to get where it is today. If you wish to uncover more of these forgotten stories, subscribe to Medical Obscura and press the notification bell. Join us as we continue to explore the shadows where science and the unexplained collide. We have many more cases to open.